She was 9 years old, and she weighed 61 pounds. And she had a gap between her front teeth. And she was standing between 4 teenage boys and a man in a wheelchair with her arms slightly out. And she was not moving, not a step back, not a flinch. 61 pounds of third grader in a red jacket holding a line. The 4 boys were 15 and 16, and one of them was 17. And they had been in this park for 40 minutes. And in that time they had done the specific arithmetic that certain boys do when they are looking for a target. They had found a man alone in a wheelchair without anyone nearby who was going to stop them. They had said things. They had gotten louder when the things they said got no reaction. One of them had kicked the wheel of the chair. They had expected the man to leave or to react or to do something that would give them the next thing to do. Then the 9-year-old got up from the bench 20 yards away and walked to the space between them and the man in the wheelchair and turned her back to the man and her face to the boys and put her arm slightly out. She was not afraid, or she was afraid, and had decided that the fear was not the part that mattered right now. 6 adults were within sight of that bench. 6 adults heard the boys. Not one of them moved. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, in standing up when the world turns away, please take a moment to comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Arena. Stories like this one remind us that compassion can still change everything. The park went quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when something is happening that nobody knows how to name yet. The teenagers looked at the 9-year-old. The 9-year-old looked at the teenagers. The man in the wheelchair looked at the 9-year-old's back, small in a red jacket, arms out, and then a man who owns a motorcycle repair shop came around the corner of the path and stopped. Walt Greer, the biker, was 53 years old, and he had been going to Riverside Park in Clarksville, Tennessee for 3 years on Tuesday afternoons, because Tuesday afternoons were when his schedule produced a gap between the shop and whatever the evening held, and the park was quiet, and quiet was something he still needed in the specific way that men need things they cannot always name. He ran a motorcycle repair shop on Dover Road. He had been in the Army from 1988 to 1995, which included a deployment to Kuwait in 1991 that lasted 9 months and which had given him, among other things, a permanent appreciation for a landscape that was not under any particular threat. He was broad and gray at the temples and had a face that had absorbed a considerable amount of weather and settled into something that most people at a first encounter read as formidable before they read anything else. The cut on the back of his jacket named his chapter. He had been wearing one for 17 years. He carried something that most of the men he rode with also carried, though they did not discuss it in those terms, which was a specific knowledge of what it meant to serve and come home to a country that was grateful in the abstract and not always attentive in the particular. He had known men who had served and come home and found themselves invisible in a way that their service had not prepared them for. He had known men who had done what their country asked of them and received in return a handshake at the airport, and in the ordinary difficulty of being a man in America. Unremarkable, unglamorous, making do. He had spent 17 years with his chapter doing what he could about that particular situation, which included showing up when the situation called for showing up. He was cutting through the park toward his truck, parked across the street. When he heard the noise, he walked toward it. He came around the corner of the path and saw the teenager. He saw the wheelchair. He saw the child between them, small in a red jacket, arms out. He stopped. He looked at all of it for a moment. Then he walked forward. Before we find out what Walt Greer did next, hit subscribe and drop your city and state in the comments right now. People are watching this tonight from everywhere, and I want to know where you are. I read every single one. Now, back to Riverside Park. Because before we get to Walt, we need to understand the girl in the red jacket and the man she put herself between. Her name was Nora Prentice. She was 9 years old and in 3rd grade at Lincoln Elementary, where her teacher described her in the most recent parent-teacher conference as someone who noticed things that other children her age tended to not notice. This was said as a compliment and received as one. Nora had been noticing things for as long as she could remember. And one of the things she had noticed was that the world contained a gap between what people said they believed and what they did when something in front of them required believing it. She was small for 9. The 61 pounds was accurate. Her mother had weighed her at the doctor last month, and she had a gap between her front teeth that she had stopped worrying about sometime around 2nd grade. She wore the red jacket because it was her favorite and because her grandmother had given it to her and because red was a color that knew where it stood. She kept a folded piece of paper in the jacket's inside pocket, a list written in pencil of things she wanted to do before she turned 10. Not large things, feed a stray cat, learn to whistle, finish a book about the girl on the horse, stand up for someone. She had added the last one after her grandfather, her mother's father, who was 70 years old and used a wheelchair on his bad days and had been in the army for 22 years. Told her a story about a time long ago when he was young and in a difficult place, and someone had stood up for him without being asked. He had never forgotten the person. He had never been able to thank them. He had always thought that if he'd had the chance, he would have wanted them to know that it mattered. Nor thought about that story sometimes. She was sitting on a bench near the duck pond with her older brother Caleb, who was 13 and who had gone to buy water from the vending machine by the park entrance. When she heard the noise near the man in the wheelchair, she looked. She watched for 30 seconds. She counted 6 adults within sight of the bench. She watched them not move. She got up. Gerald Maroon was 68 years old and a Marine and had served in Vietnam and had come home from Vietnam and had spent the 50 years since then building a life in Clarksville, Tennessee with his wife Patrice and their 3 children, and the particular daily commitment to dignity that men of his generation and background understood to be not a luxury but a discipline. He had a dry sense of humor and a long memory and an opinion about most things that he kept until asked, which was not as often as he would have preferred. He had been using the wheelchair for 4 years, a spinal condition service that had been building for a decade before it finally required accommodation. He did not regard the chair as a diminishment, though he was aware that other people did. He had developed over 4 years a finely calibrated sense of when other people's perception of the chair was about to become his problem. He knew when he saw the 4 teenagers at the edge of the duck pond that Tuesday was going to be one of those days. He went to Riverside Park every Tuesday. Patrice dropped him at the entrance at 2 o'clock in the afternoon and picked him up at 3. He brought bread for the ducks. Whole wheat pre-sliced crust he saved from the week's loaves in a bread bag on the kitchen counter. He had been doing this for 11 years. The ducks at Riverside Park knew his arrival by the sound of his wheels on the path and came in from the water before he reached the edge. He was not going to let 4 teenagers ruin a Tuesday he had been looking forward to since Saturday. He fed the ducks. He ignored worse. The first things they said were the kind of things that teenage boys say when they are testing the weight of a target. Not yet committed. Still gauging. He gave them nothing. The second round was louder. He gave them nothing. The third round included a kick to the near wheel of the chair. A glancing kick enough to rock it slightly. He looked at the boy who had done it. He looked at him with the expression of a Marine who has been in situations that this boy could not imagine, and who has decided on this particular Tuesday that this boy was going to hear the truth about himself in a way that would cost Gerald nothing and stay with the boy longer than the boy expected. He took a breath, and then a small girl in a red jacket walked into the space between them. Gerald Maroon looked at the back of her red jacket. Her arms were slightly out. Her feet were planted. He had seen this dance before in a different context in a country that this child had never heard of, performed by men who were willing to pay the cost of it. He sat very still in his wheelchair, and he watched her stand. The lead teenager, the 17-year-old, the one who had kicked the wheel, looked at the 9-year-old in the red jacket and tried to determine what category this fell under. She was not moving. She was looking at him with the specific directness of a child who has decided not to be afraid, which looked different from the directness of a child who wasn't afraid to begin with. She knew exactly how small she was. She was doing it anyway. He said something to her. She didn't answer. She didn't move. He said something else louder. She looked at him steadily and said in a voice that was clear and even, "Leave him alone." No hesitation. The park, which had been going about its Tuesday afternoon business, a mother with a stroller, a jogger. The 6 adults who had looked away went briefly, completely silent. The teenagers looked at each other. That was when Walt Greer, the biker, came around the corner of the path. He did not run. He walked at the pace of a man who has decided where he is going and has no uncertainty about it. He came to the place where Nora was standing, and he stopped. He stood next to her, not in front of her. Next to her, his shoulder a foot from Hayes. He looked at the teenagers. He looked down at Nora and said in a voice that was the same volume it always was, "You okay?" 2 words directed at her, the 9-year-old. The teenagers looked at the man in the cut, standing next to the 9-year-old. They looked at the 9-year-old. They looked at each other with a specific expression of people recalibrating what they thought was a simple situation and finding it had become something else entirely. The 17-year-old said something that was supposed to sound like he was choosing to leave rather than being made to leave. He started walking. The others followed. They went quickly and without looking back. Walt watched them go. He looked at Nor. That took nerve, he said. Nor let out a breath she had been holding for approximately 4 minutes. He crouched down to her level, the particular crouch of a man who has spent a fair amount of time communicating with small people at their own height, and he asked her name. She told him. He asked why she did it. She thought about the answer for a moment in the serious way of someone who is trying to be accurate rather than impressive. My grandpa uses a wheelchair, she said on his bad days. Walt looked at her. He looked at Gerald, who was still at the edge of the duck pond with a bread bag in his hands, watching this conversation with an expression that was going to be very difficult to describe to Patrice when she came at 3. Walt stood and walked to Gerald and introduced himself and shook Gerald's hand and asked if he was hurt. Gerald said no. Walt asked where he served. Gerald said Vietnam, 3rd Marine Division, 1968 to 1970. Walt said Kuwait, 101st Airborne, 1991. They looked at each other in the way of men who have both been somewhere that changed them and know without saying so that the other one understands what that sentence costs. Gerald looked at Noel, who had been joined by her brother Caleb, who had come running from a vending machine when he saw the crowd and had arrived, water bottle in hand, just in time to see none of the worst of it and all of what came after. Young lady, Gerald said to Noel. He said it quietly. He said it the way you say something you have been carrying a long time and have just been given permission to put down. What you did was he stopped. He tried again. I'm going to remember that, he said. Nor nodded. She looked at her shoes briefly and then back at Gerald. My grandpa would have done the same thing, she said. Gerald looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face did the thing that faces do when too much arrives at once. Walt looked at the duck pond. He looked at the sky. He took out his phone. He made 4 calls in 9 minutes. He said Gerald Maroon's name. He said Vietnam, 3rd Marine Division. He said Riverside Park. He said the time. The last call was to Ronnie Stokes' engines. The bikers came into Clarksville from 3 directions in the late October afternoon. From the chapter, from the surrounding chapters, from the people who had received a call or a text in the previous 3 hours, and had put their cut on and gotten on their bike and headed south or north or east without asking for a reason beyond the one Walt had given, which was sufficient. 237 motorcycles. They came down Riverside Drive and turned into the park's main lot and overflowed into the street. And the engines cut out in sequence, starting at the front of the line and moving back until the last one went silent, and the park and the street around it went quiet in the way that only happens when many engines have all stopped at once. The duck pond was at the back of the park down a paved path through the October trees. Gerald Maroon was still there. Walt had asked him to stay and Patrice had been called, and she had said she was coming immediately, and Walt had said please give us 1 hour. She had said why? He had said please. She had said 1 hour. Gerald was still there because Noel was still there. She had told Caleb to go home and tell their mother where she was, which Caleb had done with the specific reluctant obedience of a 13-year-old who could tell that the situation was important and that his sister was in the middle of it, and that going home was a correct thing to do, even though he didn't want to. Nor sat on the bench near the duck pond with her red jacket zipped and her hands in her pockets and watched the path. She heard the engines before she saw anyone. Walt heard them, and something in his face shifted. The first genuine change of expression in the past hour, a loosening of something that had been held carefully in place. Ronnie Stokes was the first one down the path. He was 51 years old and had been chapter president for 6 years and had the build of a man who had spent decades making himself useful and the face of a man who had seen enough to not be surprised by much. He walked down the paved path through the October trees with the afternoon light coming through in long horizontal lines, and behind him the path was filled with people to abreast as far back as a curve. He walked to where Walt was standing near the duck pond. He looked at Gerald Maroon. He looked at Gerald's chair, at the patch of road dust on the near wheel where it had been kicked, at the bread bag still in Gerald's hands, at Gerald's face, which was doing something that faces do when they are trying to remain composed and are running out of time to manage it. Ronnie Stokes stood straight. He raised his right hand to his forehead. He held it there behind him on the path through the trees. One by one, every person who had come down that path did the same thing. 237 people standing in the October light at Riverside Park in Clarksville, Tennessee, with their right hands at their foreheads and their eyes on a Marine who had served in Vietnam in 1968 and who had spent 56 years since then being seen by the country he served in the incomplete and intermittent way that it sees its veterans, and who were being seen now in a different and total way. and who is not going to be able to hold his composure for much longer. The silence was complete. The ducks moved on the water and made no sound. Gerald Maroon straightened in his chair. He raised his right hand. He held it there. Patrice Maroon arrived at Riverside Park at 4:47 in the afternoon, which was 1 hour and 47 minutes after Walt Greer had asked her to give them 1 hour, and which she had allowed because she had heard something in his voice on the phone that told her the hour would be worth the wait. She parked on the street and walked to the park entrance and looked at the motorcycles, which were still there, which was 237 of them. She walked through them and down the path through the trees and found her husband at the duck pond with Walt Greer and a 9-year-old girl in a red jacket sitting on the bench beside him. And she found 237 people still present in the October evening, unhurried, in no particular rush to be anywhere else. She stood at the edge of the gathering and looked at her husband, who she had been married to for 43 years, who had served his country and came home and raised her children and drove her to every appointment and fixed every broken thing and loved her in the daily and specific way that was better than any declaration, and who was looking at her now with an expression that she recognized and had not seen in some time. She whispered his name. He reached for her hand. Noah watched this from the bench and then looked at the duck pond where the ducks had come back in the past hour and were moving in their unhurried circles, unbothered by any of the events of the afternoon. Walt stood nearby. He did not feel the need to narrate what was happening or to make it larger than it was. It was already the right size. He stayed until 6. He said goodbye to Gerald and Patrice and shook Gerald's hand again and told him it had been an honor. Gerald said, "The honor is shared." Walt said, "Yes, sir." He looked at Noah. "Your grandpa taught you right," he said. "Noah thought about this." She nodded. He walked back up the path and got on his bike, and the engines around him came on one by one, and the line filed out of the lot and back onto Riverside Drive, and the park gave them back to the city, and the city gave them back to the road, and the road gave them home. Patrice drove Gerald home, and they sat at the kitchen table for a long time without the television on, which was how they sat when they had things to say that needed to be quiet. Gerald told her about the teenagers, and he told her about the girl in the red jacket, and he told her about the man who had stood next to her. He told her about the path through the trees and the people on it and the silence when the salute held. Patrice listened to all of it. She had been listening to Gerald for 43 years. She had heard him describe things that she could not have experienced herself. Things from the war, things from the years after, things that had no simple translation into the language of a life that had not contained them. She had learned to listen for the thing under that was being said, which was most of the time the desire to be known. When he was done, she said, "A 9-year-old in a red jacket," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "She's going to be all right," she said. "That girl is going to be all right." Gerald looked at the kitchen window. "Yes," he said. Noah Prentice got home at 5:30. Her mother was in the kitchen, and Caleb had told her most of it. And her mother asked questions, and Noah answered them. And her mother held her for a long time and didn't say anything while she was holding her, which was the right response. After dinner, Noah went to her room. She took the folded piece of paper from the inside pocket of her red jacket. She unfolded it on the desk under the lamp and found the pencil in her drawer and looked at the list. Feed a stray cat, learn to whistle. Finish the book about the girl on the horse. Stand up for someone. She drew a line through the last one. Slow, straight, certain. She looked at what remained. She picked up the pencil and added one more item at the bottom of the list in the careful printing of someone who is writing something they mean to keep. Come back to the park. She folded the paper back along its original lines. She put it in the pocket of the red jacket which was hanging on the back of her chair. She turned off the lamp. There are adults who see injustice in a public place and calculate the cost of acting. There are adults who find the cost too high. And then there are 9-year-olds who have not yet learned to calculate that particular cost, who have only learned from a grandfather who knew that you stand between the person behind you and whatever's in front of them, and you do not move. 237 people drove to a park in Tennessee because they understood that a man who gave that same gift to his country deserved to receive it back. The mathematics check out. If this story reaches you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that courage doesn't have a minimum size. Hit subscribe and type no in the comments if this one stayed with you. I'll read everyone.